This is the second in a series of videos about swine in Celtic mythology, or at least that's what I started out to study. Once again, I'll be posting a PDF with all the references I used to make this video on my Patreon, plus some related reading. So quite a bit of it is available online, and I'll include those links for you. Patreon is a big part of how I manage to keep things going, making free content for YouTube with no mid-roll ads. Have you noticed? Your support on Patreon really helps me to make ends meet. If that's too much commitment, the link to buy me a cup of tea on Ko-fi is below the video. If you haven't seen the first video, which I posted a couple of weeks ago, you might want to head back and watch it first. But in case you don't want to do that, here's a quick summary. Last time, I talked quite a bit about Mabon ap Modron, a character from Welsh literature, and Maponos, a deity who was worshipped both in Gaul as a healer and in North Britain. In Gaul, he's associated with a hot spring where people went for healing, and an inscription to him suggests that he's able to intercede with underworld spirits. In North Britain, Maponos is more associated with hunting and music, which would probably include poetry, and he's often associated with Apollo, the lyre player. The names Mabon and Maponos both mean divine son, and they also have a reflex in Ireland, Angus Macog. Mabon's main story is in the old Welsh tale called Culhwch and Olwen, where he's portrayed as a skilled huntsman and dog handler who takes a leading role in the hunting of a huge boar called a tuath Truth. Angus appears in many Irish stories, but in one particular story, which we've been looking at, his lover, a woman called Drevran, has 6 foster children who are turned into pigs, and Angus tries unsuccessfully to help them. So these two deities, already related in various ways, each have a story in which pigs feature. Now, pigs feature in a lot of Welsh and Irish stories. So is it that significant? Perhaps. The pigs in Angus' story all have names. The ones I'm interested in are called Caelchis, which means slender pig, and Fréachán, which means little heather. Remember those names. Back in Mabon's story, the big boar they're hunting is followed by his brood of piglets. One of them, who takes a leading role in the story, is called Griggin, which means little heather. Caelchis, the slender pig, also has a counterpart in the tale of Culhwch and Olwen, the hero Culhwch himself, whose name also means slender pig. This doesn't seem like a coincidence, and the prominence of Griggin in particular has always intrigued me. The two stories are quite different, and Culhwch is a prince, not a pig, although his mother gives birth to him in a pigsty. Yet in both stories, the pigs are hunted, and all but one are killed. It isn't the pig with the heathery name who gets away, though, in case you're wondering. The pigs in Culhwch and Olwen are hunted by Mabon and King Arthur, but Angus tries to protect the pigs in the Irish story. They're hunted by Maeve and Ailill. That story has a lot of versions, including one where the pigs are said to come out of the cave of Cruachan. And as I mentioned last week, there's an inscription near the entrance of that cave which says Fráech, in other words, Heather, son of Maeve. As some of you may know, there are also stories and poems about a man of the Sidhe called Fráech, who's in love with Finnebher, the daughter of Maeve and Ailill. Fráech, of course, means heather. So there are no pigs in this story, no Angus, obviously no Mabon, since it's an Irish story, just this character Fráech. But I've always suspected that there was something here. Would it provide an answer to the question of the heathery pigs on both sides of the Irish Sea? At first, reading the story of the cattle raid of Fráech, I was frustrated. It's a good story, but I couldn't see any connection. I think I was trying too hard, and once things settled, I began to see interesting connections to other stories. And I'll share those with you. But first, I'd better tell you the story of Fráech. Fráech was a young man of the Sidhe, although his father, Idath, was a mortal of the people of Connacht. His mother was Bay Finn, the fair woman of the Sidhe Mounds and the sister of Boand. Fráech had long, curling black hair and fine grey eyes, athletic and slender with fair white skin. For 8 years he'd kept his own household, with 50 princes as fair as himself for companions. His mother had given him 12 fairy cows, white with red ears. Fráech's fame had spread throughout Ireland and Scotland. You probably know that Maeve and Ailill are the Connacht queen and king who start the squabbling, which quickly escalated into the Táin Bó Fráech, the cattle raid of Cooley. Maeve and Ailill had a lovely daughter called Finnever. Now Finnever had heard of Fráech's beauty and fame, and she set her heart on him, even though she'd never seen him. Word of this reached Fráech, and he decided to go and have a look. But first he went to his mother's sister Boann and asked for gifts and treasures to take with him. She gave him 50 blue cloaks, dark and shining, each with a red gold brooch, and 50 white shirts with gold embroidery, 50 silver shields with rims of gold, and all manner of weapons of gold and silver set with precious stones, 50 soft grey mares with gold and silver bridles with golden bells, 50 purple saddle cloths. They had 7 hunting hounds chained with silver and gold, 7 horn blowers with horns of gold and silver, clad in clothes of every color. There were 3 jesters with bright cloaks and silver diadems, and 3 harpers in royal attire. And thus they set off for Cruachan, the stronghold of Maeve and Ailill. When Maeve's people saw them coming, they were not unimpressed. They saw Fráech riding at the head of his men, doing feats with a spear as he rode. He would throw the spear, and the 7 hounds with the silver chains would catch it in the air. The people came out of Cruachan to see them in such a press that some were trampled. They dismounted at the gates of the fort, unharnessed their horses, and unleashed their hounds. They hunted the 7 deer of Cruachan and 7 foxes, 7 hares, and 7 wild boars. The hounds then entered the river and returned with 7 otters, and all this bounty they piled at the gate. They were given hospitality and a quarter of the house for their use, and they saw that the house of Maeve and Ailill was also beautiful and impressive. Ailill said that a feast should be prepared, but Maeve wished to play chess with Fráech on her beautiful board with its gold and silver pieces. So they began to play. "Let your harpers play for us," said Maeve to Fráech. They took their harps from harp bags of otter skin and deer skin, decorated with red and silver and gold. The harps also were of gold and silver and white bronze. They were carved with figures of serpents and birds and hounds. And when the harps played, the animals came to life and ran in circles around the harpers. The music was so beautifully sad that 12 men died of weeping and heartbreak hearing it. These harpers were the sons of Boann, and they played the 3 noble strains of music: sadness from Boann's weeping and sorrow at the birth of the first, laughter and joy for the elation of Boann at the birth of the second, and sleep and gentleness to mark her rest after the birth of the third. The gameplay between Fráech and Maeve continued for 3 days and nights until Maeve finally came to her senses. I think she might have been enjoying having the attention of this beautiful young man all to herself, but she realized that she had been a poor host and everyone was still waiting to eat. So the food was finally served and they all feasted. A fortnight passed, and each day Fráech and his huntsmen drove game toward the fort, and the men of Connacht would watch them. While this was a pleasant pastime, Fráech had still not exchanged any word with Finnever. Then one morning he went to the river to wash and found her on the same errand. He took her hand and said, "Stop and talk to me a while. It is to see you that I have come to this court." Finnever was pleased, but she knew she must be careful. "Would you elope with me?" asked Fráech. "No," she said, "because of my parents, and I think you can afford my dowry." Then she gave him a ring that Maeve had told her to keep safe, saying it was a love token. Maeve and Ailill knew the pair had met, and they were unsure what to do, but Fráech approached them and asked for Finnever. "Will you give me the bride price I ask for?" said Ailill. "If I can," Fráech replied. 60 dark grey horses with gold bridle bits, 12 milk cows, and each having a calf with red ears, and that you bring me your men in full force and your musicians to fight in the cattle raid of Culnia." This was the bride price Ailill demanded, and Fráech said, "I swear by my shield and armour that I wouldn't give you that for Maeve herself." And he strode away. Maeve and Ailill feared that Fráech would carry Finnever off, so they made a plan to kill him. Later that day, they suggested that everyone should go to the river to bathe. "I have heard you're a good swimmer," Ailill said to Fráech. "Have a swim in that pool there so we can watch you." "Is it safe?" asked Fráech. "Oh, I believe so," came the reply. So Fráech made a heap of his things, stripped off his clothes, and began to swim. On the bank, Ailill went through his belongings and found the ring. He showed it to Maeve, who confirmed his suspicions, and then he flung it into the river. Fráech saw him do it, and he also saw a salmon leap up and swallow it. Ailill missed that as he turned away. So Fráech caught the salmon by the gills and hid it on the river bank. He made to come out of the water, but Ailill said, "Before you come out, grab me a bunch of those rowan berries that are growing on the opposite bank." So Fráech fetched them, and Finnever looked at the beautiful sight of her beloved, so shapely, so beautiful, carrying the branch of red rowans, and she knew she would never see a sight half as beautiful. Fráech brought them the branch, but they demanded more, so he started off for the far bank again. Suddenly a water monster seized him. "Give me a sword," he cried, but no one dared to help him for fear of Maeve and Ailill. So Finnever quickly stripped and plunged into the water with a sword. Ailill hurled a 5-barbed spear at his daughter, but it only caught her hair. Fráech, still gripped by the monster, hurled the spear back with such precision that it pierced Ailill's clothing, but never wounded him. Only then did Fráech take the sword and cut off the monster's head, but it still clung to him, and the wound was terrible. Ailill said to Maeve, "I regret that, but Finnever will die tomorrow. I will arrange it." Then he had a bath made for Fráech, a broth of unsalted bacon and the flesh of a heifer chopped into it. Fráech came into the fort, preceded by his horn players, who played so beautiful that 30 of Ailill's finest men died of raptures. Fráech was bathed and put into a bed, and then they heard a great sound of weeping over Cruachan, and there appeared 50 women of the Sidhe, wearing crimson tunics and green headdresses, with silver bracelets on their wrists, weeping for Fráech, the darling of the Sidhe of Erin. And Fráech bade them to take him away. So they lifted him and carried him into the Sidhe mound of Cruachan. The next morning, the people of Cruachan looked up, and they saw Fráech returning, with the 50 women around him, and he was entirely whole. And as the women of the Sidhe left him, they cried and lamented so sorrowfully that the people of the court were deeply troubled. Fráech entered the fort, and Maeve and Ailill repented of the ill they had done him, and made peace with him. Unknown to them, Fráech sent word to Finnever about the ring and the salmon. And that night, as they were feasting, Ailill demanded that Finnever show him the ring Maeve had given her. And she pretended that she wasn't sure where it was, and Ailill threatened her with death unless she produced it. "If I find it," said Finnever, "then you shall have no more say over me after that." Ailill agreed, believing that the ring was in the river. Then Finnever had the cooked salmon brought on a dish with the ring laid on top. Ailill and Maeve stared in surprise. Then Ailill told how he had found the ring in Fráech's possession and thrown it into the river. And Fráech replied that he had found the ring and kept it safe, and that later Finnever had told him how she lost it, and that if he happened to find it, she would be his for a year. Finnever declared that she would only love Fráech after that, and Áile and Nev told Fráech to bring his cattle to join them in the cattle raid of Coolnia. And when you come with your cattle, you shall sleep with Finnever. Now, there's much more to this story. Fráech encountered fresh problems when he went to fetch his cows, problems that took him far from Ireland, and when he finally made it back, he was soon slain by Cuchulainn, and once again, that fight was in water. So I've told you what I think is the most interesting and exciting part of the story. I can see various connections between Fráech's story and the two stories that have pigs called Little Heather. So let's run through those, and then we'll look at some thoughts from various scholars. First, Fráech's home is underground in a she-mound. Now, this is also true of Angus. Maponos is associated with underworld spirits in an inscription from Gaul, and Mabon is freed from a dungeon. When Fráech arrives in Nev's court, he and his men, horses, and hounds are wearing fabulous and expensive items. Although he travels alone, there's also a long, detailed description of Kilhuch's turnout as he approaches Arthur's court. The boy was on a steed with a gleaming grey head, 4 winters old, well-jointed stride, shell-like hooves, and a tubular gold bridle bit in its mouth, with a precious gold saddle beneath him, and 2 sharp spears of silver in his hand. He had a battle-axe in his hand the length of the forearm of a full-grown man from ridge to edge. It would draw blood from the wind. It would be swifter than the swiftest dewdrop from the stalk to the ground when the dew is heaviest in the month of June. He had a gold-hilted sword on his thigh, and its blade of gold, with a gold-chased shield the color of heaven's lightning, and its rim of ivory. And there were 2 spotted, white-breasted greyhounds in front of him, with a collar of red gold around the neck of each, from shoulder swell to ear. He had a purple 4-cornered cloak about him, with a ruby gold ball at each corner. Each ball was worth 100 cows. The precious gold in his buskins and stirrups, from the top of his thigh to the tip of his toe, was worth 300 cows. Not even the tip of a hair on him stirred, so light was his steed's canter beneath him, on the way to the gate of Arthur's court. Perhaps more significant is Fráech's closeness to Boann. He isn't her son, but he almost feels like a reflex or body double for Boann's son Angus, the young nephew rather than the young son, but perhaps a foster son. And Fráech is presented mostly as a hunter rather than a fighter, a role which he shares with Mabon and Maponos. Then there are the masterful harpers, who are Boann's sons, which might harken back to Maponos' association with the harp. An old ballad called The Harper of Loch Mabon might even associate Mabon with the harp. Angus is also seen playing in a story called The Siege of Knoch Long, where he appears to Conn of the 100 Battles as a harper and prophet. In his hand he held a silver timpan, its strings of red gold, sweeter than any music under heaven, the sound of those strings, a bow of hide, making 100 sounds of sweet melody. Over it were 2 birds, and these birds were able to play the timpan, and not incompetently either. He sat close to me in friendly fashion as he played the timpan to inebriate my spirit. During their stay, the men of the Sidhe hunt each day, while the people of the Connacht court watch. Where do they watch from? Might it be the hunting mound of Duashelga, or one like it? I suppose we could liken Fráech's quest for Finnever to Kilhuch's quest for Olwen. There's Maeve and Aliel's murderous intent toward Fráech, which could be likened to Ysbyddaden's hostility to Kilhuch. And while Finnever loves Fráech from afar, Kilhuch also loves Olwen before he sees her. The water scene also has some parallels with Mabon's story. When Arthur's men are searching for him, it's a salmon who guides them to him, allowing him to be rescued. And the salmon in Fráech's story is also a kind of helper. Then he fights the water monster. Mabon fights the Tuath in the river Severn. He partially succeeds in his mission, and both he and the boar escape with their lives, although we never see Mabon again. But if I'm brutally honest, these are just flickering shadows. It's a bit more than just a vibe. but it's indecisive, like a crime with lots of circumstantial evidence but no witness. So it's probably time we looked more closely at the name Fráech. Daio Hogan writes, the name Fráech is derived from Celtic vroikos, meaning heather, in the sense of bristling with warrior fury. Of course, there is a Gaulish deity called Vroikos, and I'm coming to him soon. O'Hagan sees this story as a kind of Dinhenechus tale, which has been inspired by a combination of the inscription at the Cave of the Cats and two local place names, Carn Frech, that is Carn Free, and the Duvlin Freik, the dark, heathery pool. This is plausible, I suppose. I'm less convinced that this is the whole story. The story is very old and it's mentioned in a number of early texts. I think there must be more to its origins. He goes on to mention some of the more interesting variants of the story, which, like a lot of Ulster cycle stories, was passed down orally a great deal. It was very popular in Scotland as well as Ireland, so lots of versions came out of it. In the 11th century, there's a version where Fráech goes underground into the land of Down, the god of the dead, in Scotland. And then there's another version where Boan warns Fráech against having women in his household, against fighting Cuchulainn, against swimming, pledging his arms. Well, he should have listened. A poem in the Book of the Dean of Lismore says that Maeve is actually in love with Fráech, and that's why she's planning so much treachery against him, because he prefers Finnever. Sounds very Maeve, I have to say. There's an interesting look at the god Vroikos in this paper by Garrett Olmsted. He wrote a lot more about Vroikos later in Gods of the Celts and the Indo-Europeans. But a lot of that book, honestly, feels a bit like a fever dream. I think Olmsted got really carried away there. But anyway, this from 1977 I found really quite salient. He says here, Vroikos may have a connection to Mars Vorocius, whose name is inscribed on a bronze ring from a spring at Vichy. Although here the etymological relationship is not so clear as that between Fráech and Vroikos. An incised shard from the spring at Vichy also shows a warrior in front of a snake, and Thevenot, another scholar, sees this as a representation of Vorocius Mars. The representation at Mavili of Mars with a snake on a stone relief from a temple at the confluence of two streams, dating to the Claudian era, gives substance to Thevenot's suggestion. The presence of the snake and the association with water draws a connection to Irish legends of Fráech. The serpent is suggestive of the water monster battled by Fráech. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find images of these. David Stifter has recently written a paper about an inscription which has both Vroich and Mukkoi, which refers to pigs, in it. He says the inscription consists of an individual name, in other words, Netta Vroich, the two formula words Maki, son, and Mukkoi, belonging to the kin group and the name of an ancestor. To sum up, it's my contention that, parallel to the cereal metaphor for a kin group as the seed or the oats of an eponymous ancestor, a similar livestock metaphor was in use, in which the offspring was thought of as being part of the ancestral litter, in other words, the piglets. This fits very well with the entry in Cormac's glossary, in which we learn that a rare Irish word for pig is used to describe a son. Or Treith, then, means a king's son, and bears relationship to the Turk Truth, the boar in Kilochan-Olwen, who is said to have once been a human king. But back to David Stifter. He goes on to talk about the Fráech element, which he says corresponds to the name that is otherwise found as Fráech, O fada E, or Fráech, A fada E. This early attested variation in the spelling of the diphthong, which is found long before the merger in the 9th century, suggests that we are perhaps dealing with two separate names. One identical with the common name Old Irish heather, and the other one identical with Old Irish fury, or fierceness, if these are two different words in the first place, he says. So he's not sure, and I can see why he's not sure, having seen lots of scholars go through some big acrobatics to explain why these two words are the same, such as that heroes get red in the face like heather, or the prickliness of heather is analogous to the use of weapons, and so on. It's clearly a name with a heroic subtext, and it's probably a fairly common name because of that. So we might think of our two little piglets as being named Little Hero. We might. I'm not sure that we should. But it also confirms this connection between pig and king, piglet and king's son or royal boy. I even wondered whether this might have been a common pet name for young pigs, in much the same way people name dogs Prince and Samson. Are we any further forward in this exploration? Certainly, the existence of a Celtic deity called Vroikos, Heather, is interesting, and the serpent fighting Mars Voreikius is associated with a thermal spring, which is also the case with Maponos, while Angus is associated with the Brú na Boine, home to an otherworldly well, which also has a salmon dwelling in it. Oh, we could go on endless circles in which the stories of Mabon, Fráech, Angus, and others follow an orbit which passes through many of the same regions: pigs, princes, wells, rivers, hunting, the underworld, lovers with murderous parents. I'll leave you to think about things a bit, and I'll be back with one last video to try out some theories and take another look at boar hunts. I've got classes starting soon about Mabon, Lugus, the Triads of Britain, and stories of animal transformation, plus a short session called The Mysteries of Mabon. If you have a look at that one, you might find some free tickets if they haven't all been snapped up. I'd love to see you in one of my classes. Bye for now.